I want to go to Paula Reed, our chief legal affairs correspondent. The Supreme Court apparently striking down a ban on bump stocks. Do we have that correct? Paula, give us the latest.
That is exactly right, Jim. This has been one of the most closely watched cases of the Supreme Court term, and it's another example of the High Court siding with gun rights groups. Now, we're still going through this opinion, but here the Supreme Court has struck down a federal ban on bump stocks. Now, this was approved by former President Trump, and again, it's the latest example, too, of the court sort of limiting the power of federal agencies to act on their own. Now, this is one of a few different cases related to gun rights that we are watching. We're still working our way through this Thomas opinion, but this was originally a challenge from a gun store owner to the classification of bump stocks as machine guns. And the Supreme Court, again, this is one of the biggest cases that they've been examining, and here they have struck down this federal ban. So we're still going through this opinion, and we'll have more in a few minutes.
Yeah, and Paula, I mean, this is a pretty significant ruling. As I recall, when I was covering the Trump administration, I know you were there as well, Paula. This came during the Trump administration, and it was a disappointment to gun rights supporters back then, but it came in the aftermath of some major mass shootings in this country.
That's exactly right. And specifically, it came in 2017 after the mass shooting in Las Vegas, where a gunman, of course, opened fire with a semi-automatic rifle that had a bump stock device that helped him kill 58 people. Hundreds more people were, of course, wounded. But again, here are the Supreme Court striking down this classification.
All right, and I believe we have Elie Honig standing by. Oh, Paula, I'm going to stay with you just a little bit longer. Do we know the breakdown of this decision, how it broke down, who was on which side?
We don't yet physically have the opinion when the Supreme Court releases its opinions. Our colleagues do. They're working through it right now. I don't physically have it, but I'm told that Thomas authored this opinion. But during oral arguments, we did get a sense of exactly where people were falling on this. It's not a shock that they have struck this down, but some of the liberal justices, they appeared skeptical, not surprisingly, about doing this. So it will be interesting to see the exact count in terms of how this split across the justices. And like I said, this is one of two major gun rights cases that we are watching in the Supreme Court. The other one is a question about whether someone who has a restraining order related to domestic violence can own a gun. That is another one that we're watching and waiting for. It's unclear if this is our last opinion for the day or if we'll have any more. So far, we've had two lesser known, more technical cases, but this so far this morning, the biggest headline out of the court.
Very big headline, Paula Reed. Thank you. And just so our viewers know, I mean, this is going to be a disappointment to folks who would like to see more regulation, more laws cracking down on gun violence in this country. Bump stocks allow a shooter to convert a semi-automatic rifle into a weapon that can fire at a rate of hundreds of rounds a minute. Some folks would say almost making it like an automatic weapon. Let me go to Andrew McCabe. He's standing by as well. Andrew, your response to all this?
Well, Jim, I'm just walking through the opinion now, but it seems that the court has taken a very kind of a textual approach to the underlying law that makes it illegal to have a machine gun. And so what the ATF did when they changed the rules, essentially banning bump stocks, they classified a semi-automatic rifle, which is not a machine gun, is lawfully owned in this country, a semi-automatic rifle with a bump stock as a machine gun, and therefore essentially banned it as a machine gun. The ruling states that the ATF exceeded their statutory authority when they reclassified semi-automatic rifles with bump stocks as machine guns. Now, it's well known that the ATF took that action in response to the Las Vegas mass shooting, in which the shooter used several weapons equipped with bump stocks, thus rendering those semi-automatic weapons firing in a way very similar to machine guns. So the ATF's reclassification was in response to a bloody massacre and also had the effect of essentially regulating how the rifle works, not how it's mechanically functions and how it's classified under the law, but rather like what is the effect of putting a bump stock on a semi-automatic weapon. This court has weighed in today to say that no, you can't do that. The law that Congress passed very clearly defines a machine gun as a weapon that fires multiple rounds with one function of the trigger. That is not the same as a semi-automatic weapon equipped with a bump stock. Therefore, ATF exceeded the bounds of their legal authority. I think people on the gun safety regulation side of this issue will be reasonably very frustrated with what they perceived as a proactive effort by the ATF to render these weapons, semi-automatic weapons that have been essentially converted to fire like a machine gun, illegal. Those guns and the bump stocks that change the way they work will now be once again accessible to anyone in this country.
All right, Andrew, stay with us. I want to go back to Paula Reed to see if she has more. Paula, what more do you know at this point?
I do have more, Jim. Most importantly, I now have the opinion so we can see the count. As I said before, Justice Clarence Thomas wrote the opinion. It was 6-3. The court's liberal wing, led by Justice Sonia Sotomayor, dissented. Now, in the opinion, Justice Thomas wrote, a bump stock does not convert a semi-automatic rifle into a machine gun any more than a shooter with a lightning-fast trigger finger does. Even with a bump stock, a semi-automatic rifle will fire only one shot for every, quote, function of the trigger. Now, in this, what is described to me as a scathing dissent, Sonia Sotomayor joined her other liberal colleagues, writing, quote, the majority's ruling will have deadly consequences. Now, this is not specifically a Second Amendment case, but it did once again put the debate about guns in front of the High Court. And as I said earlier, this is one of two gun rights cases that we are watching very closely this term. This is the last opinion for today, but we do expect to get more opinions next week on some of these big cases, which could be another one of these questions about guns. The other question before them is whether someone with a domestic violence restraining order can own a gun. We just sort of looked at a similar issue in the trial of the president's son, Hunter Biden, in Wilmington, where he was convicted for lying on a form about using or being addicted to illegal drugs. There are a lot of questions about the limitations you can put on gun ownership coming back before the Supreme Court. But here, once again, siding with gun rights advocates in this decision about bump stocks.
Ellie, let me go to you first. Your response to this decision.
Well, Jim, this is important, obviously, for the reasons that Stephen and others have laid out. Important to note, though, this is not technically a Second Amendment decision. It doesn't have to do with the breadth or scope of the Second Amendment. It's an issue of statutory construction. Does a bump stock qualify as a machine gun? What we should be looking for on the Second Amendment issue will be coming out of the Supreme Court in the coming days and weeks. They're done for today, but there's another really important Second Amendment case titled United States versus Rahimi, where a person is challenging the federal criminal laws that say you cannot possess a firearm if you're a certain type of prohibited person. In that case, the question is whether that law should apply to somebody who's subject to a domestic violence restraining order. The Supreme Court heard oral argument on that. They may strike down that law. And related to that, I should note, Hunter Biden, he's not a party to any of these cases, but he was just convicted under a similar statute that says you cannot have a firearm if you are an addict. He's sure to appeal that, and maybe months or years from now, that will reach the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court clearly has been taking on these cases, and they're sort of rethinking and reconsidering the prohibitions on gun ownership. Who are people who are legally not allowed to possess a firearm?
Yeah, and Joey Jackson, I'm looking at Justice Sonia Sotomayor's scathing dissent in this decision. She wrote that this decision, quote, hamstrings the government's efforts to keep machine guns from gunmen like the Las Vegas shooter. I mean, that is a very scathing response from Justice Sotomayor, and it sounds as though you could say this is not a Second Amendment case, but if the government is being hamstrung, as she's put it, in terms of regulating whether or not people can effectively have machine guns in this country, to a lot of folks who want to see more gun safety, they might think this is a Second Amendment case, even though it may not be technically one.
So, yeah, you know what, Jim, to that point, it's a very critical point and important. So it is a Second Amendment case, but it's not. And let's talk about that. It's not a Second Amendment case because the case itself involved an issue of interpreting what a statute means. Now, you would think that something that would ultimately allow for more bullets to come out of a weapon may classify as a machine gun, right? But no, not says the Supreme Court. And then I think you have to look at what Congress's role here, right? Congress can easily amend the statute such that it's very clear with respect to what's permissible and what's not. And so what the Supreme Court is saying is, hey, not our job. All we do essentially is interpret the plain language of the law. So statutorily, it's just about that. The Congress has the authority to do it. They did not, and as a result, the Supreme Court says it's an interpretation case. We don't view this, the bump stock issue as into the statute. Now, in terms of a Second Amendment case, Jim, it is. It involves guns. It involves the issue of how you regulate guns. It involves the right to have a gun. And so while it's not technically in keeping with the Second Amendment, I would argue that certainly it really applies and relates to issues concerning the Second Amendment, and it's very concerning. Last point, Jim, and that is certainly the dissent there, very powerful one, but it is the dissent. And until you get a Supreme Court that has more wherewithal with respect to how these laws are interpreted and whether or not you're going to interpret them to protect people against dangerous gun violence, you're going to get more decisions like that, and that's highly problematic.